Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is coping strategies. We cultivate all kinds of strategies to cope with situations, emotions, to sort of deflect them. So sometimes we cope with the response of anger or numbing or humor, or anyway, there's a multitude of these kinds of behaviors, and we'll be talking about that today and how we might be able to maybe instead just process things as they arise, or at least in time proximity to when they arise, if not immediately. So before we get started, let's just take a couple minutes first to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light, lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together, vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop. And allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables us to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, Rosalind. Good morning, everyone who's joining us. So wonderful to have you here with us this morning. So we're talking about coping strategies, and life presents all kinds of challenges to us that we often respond to with discomfort and stress, the experience of stress. And so we find ways to cope. We find behaviors, coping strategies that help to us to mitigate or modulate the experience of those stressors. And we can find that these behaviors span a pretty broad spectrum, from anger to eating to just numbing ourselves out in a multitude of different ways, to sleeping, to all these kinds of coping mechanisms. And it occurs to me that perhaps one of the best coping mechanisms is to be addressing what's there when it's there. What a concept, right? Now, we don't always have that option, because it may be that there's some deep processing that the circumstances don't necessarily lend themselves to in a specific moment. But if we're present to the fact that we're under stress or that we're experiencing stress, if we're present to the fact that we've got a lot going on, and then deliberately and consciously allocate time and energy to addressing those emotions, then what will happen is that we lift the oppression or the pressure of those stressors, uh, and actually allow ourselves to metabolize, to process those things through, rather than finding ways to cope, which allows, oftentimes one of the ways that we cope is we suppress those emotions. We suppress our reaction, and uh, put things to the back burner. Admittedly, sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes a situation is such that we really need to just rally all our forces, and there's not the opportunity to process through everything. And oftentimes the processing happens on so many different levels. You know, when we're experiencing some kind of emergency, or we're experiencing a shock, or a loss or grief, we don't necessarily have the opportunity to, in the moment, focus our attention on that emotional need to process. And so the coping mechanisms come in, which is a gift, to be able to have that way, that strategy, even though it's not necessarily a conscious strategy, to have a strategy to deal with and to be able to move through deep challenges. The thing is that we often then forget that attention is needed. You know, it may not be, we may not have had the opportunity to provide that attention in a moment that, in the exact moment that it was initially needed, but we do have, if we refuse to address it at some point, or neglect to address it at some point, it will come back and bite us on some level, because it's an energetic pattern that that will persist in some ways, and sometimes accelerate. You know, ignoring something doesn't actually necessarily make it go away. You know, if we can address these emotions, the closer we can address these emotions to the time that they arise, the better off we're going to be. And sometimes it's nothing more needed. There's nothing more needed than to feel the feelings, just to feel the feelings, to allow ourselves to move it through the body. And I think that so many of us have a fear of getting lost in the emotion, getting lost in depression, getting lost in grief, getting lost in rage, and feel that, and feel and fear that we won't be able to reclaim ourselves. And if we can cultivate the notion of emotion as an essential teacher, then the whole experience of those emotions can become less terrifying. Um, it's almost like a cleansing fire. I'm just thinking of a consuming love, for example, or a consuming grief. And when we think of that consuming, what is it that's happening? What is it that's being consumed? It's a good question to be looking at, where if we think about the cleansing fire, consuming fire, that it's clearing away whatever that energy is. It's allowing it to move. What happens when we deflect or ignore these energies is that they find residence in our physical body, ultimately, with aches and pains and dis-ease over time. And so to find a way to process through it is important. And I want to be clear, though, that as we talk about this notion of processing through, we're not necessarily intellectualizing. It's so interesting. I had a session with a client who's very adept at psychoanalysis sort of inquiry, to be able to notice, oh, there's a pattern, and what's the why behind the pattern. And it's one thing to recognize that there are certain things that act as triggers. Being able to identify triggers is a great thing. And then it's a great thing as long as we use it to go deeper, to be able to get to a point where we're dissolving that trigger. But we can find ourselves deeply enamored of the stories behind our behaviors that validate and justify and explain and essentially give us ways to hold an understanding that keeps those behaviors in place, that keeps those patterns in place. And I was always somebody who's interested in the why of things. But what I realize is that why is not as important as the experience. And what happens is we dig into, I've seen it so many times in myself and other people also, is that we get so attached to the why. But the why doesn't disappear the issue. The why doesn't dissolve the underlying patterns. What happens is that the why can become, I think the why can become almost an addiction. The why can be a justification that allows us to provide ourselves with excuses for the way that things are without necessarily creating a change or a transformation or a release from the ways that things are, or the way that things are. And so we got into it with this client it was really interesting because are very skilled and enamored of understanding the mechanisms and the reasons and not the mechanisms as much, but the reasons and the explanations. And it was in the course of the session, what was important was to be in the experience. And we often use whys as a coping strategy in a way, right? To remove ourselves, to distance ourselves from the experience itself. And so this person really wanted to dive into the why. And I said, well, we can talk about the why later. Right now, it's not relevant. And they said, why? Because you say so. And I said, yeah, I know what I'm doing here, right now. What needs to be addressed is the experience, what needs to be lived in order to get the result. The dissolving that we're looking to accomplish here is through the experience. And it's been a recent conscious discovery or conscious connection for me to recognize that the experience that we're talking about that enables us to actually dissolve certain patterns is an experience that exists on multiple levels. When we go into the why, what we're typically doing is we're trying to figure something out. We detach ourselves from our bodies and our emotions and integrating this experience, making it an experience that incorporates emotion and our awareness and our physical sensations. When we integrate those three things, things will dissolve. It's really extraordinary. And actually, we can see that even in the art of manifestation. And actually, when I hear about the art of manifestation, it's typically have a thought, see it, and have an elevated emotion around it to power it. And it occurs to me that if we are able to engage our body more consciously in that process, that it will harness this three-pronged magic that that allows us to dissolve stuck energies. We can maybe also use it to be activating energies. So when we have a vivid imagination of something, incorporating as many senses as possible and an elevated emotion, and then identify where in our body we experience that elevated emotion, and then thread these pieces together, weave them together so that we have the emotion, we have the thought, we have the sensation, that can be accelerating the energy of manifestation. As it, on the other side of things, perhaps, can dissolve stuck emotions. So stuck emotions, stuck trauma, stuck experiences. So it's an activator, perhaps, to engage on all these different levels. And if we go back to this notion of coping strategies, one of the biggest coping strategies I've seen is numbing, where we disengage. We disengage from our emotions. We disengage from our physical sensations. We disengage from our intuitive sense, and we go on automatic. We go on automatic pilot, where we're here but we're not really here, where we just disappear ourselves somehow by dissociating, and we go through the motions. And when we go through the motions in life, what happens is we're not present. So we're not really taking the opportunity to complete certain, I don't know what to say, certain journeys maybe that have been initiated, where we have a shock and what we do is just tough it out. Like we're taught, just tough it out, ignore the emotions. It was really interesting. I was talking to somebody who was schooled in a certain school of thought, and he said that they had been trained to think of emotions as just like a fart, that an emotion was just passing gas, so to speak, and that it was irrelevant. And I looked at that analogy, and if we look at it more deeply, if you're passing a lot of gas, there's a problem, right? There's something going on in the system that's out of balance. And rather than ignoring these things and overriding them, what we can do, and I think is much healthier for us to do, is to pay attention to the communications from the emotions, pay attention to the communications from the body, and not necessarily make up all kinds of stories about it, but to be present to it. So yesterday, I I was doing something in the kitchen and I pulled out a cutting board and it dropped on my foot. It was a big, heavy wooden cutting board, and the corner of it jammed into a part of my foot, and it was painful. And in the past, coping wise, I would have just ignored it, tried to ignore it, and gone on with my whatever I was doing, and just let it go away. And because I've been practicing this awareness, what I was aware of is that it really hurt. It really hurt. And so I decided to take the time to address it. And I sat down and felt it and put my hands on my foot where it was. And I allowed myself to feel it, to experience the sensation of it. And interestingly, as I did that, it got more painful. It got really painful. And then it wasn't painful anymore. But I was with it. I was allowing myself to stop, not make up stories about it, not create a whole narrative around it, but to experience it in my body, to follow the sensation, literally tracing that sensation as I felt it moving in my body. I followed that sensation, being present to it, being present to that pain, rather than trying to just pretend it didn't exist as a coping mechanism. And as I was present to that pain, it dissolved. I allowed that energy to move and it dissolved. And that's what we can do with our emotions as well, is to feel the emotions, to allow ourselves to experience it and move with it and notice that it's energy and that it's energy moving through our bodies and being. And as we presence ourselves to that emotional energy and feel it in our body and allow it to move, it will. So one of the things that I've been working with lately is brokenheartedness, and allowing myself to be present to that as it arises in waves, because typically emotions will arise in waves, and certainly grief does. I actually felt it in my heart and down my left arm, down into my fingers. I felt that grief. And as I allowed myself to feel it, it dissolved. That wave dissolved. And so, without making stories about it, we can allow ourselves to experience our experience. And rather than a coping strategy, it's a way that we can metabolize our experience by feeling the feelings, by feeling the sensations. And maybe we can't do it in the moment of their occurrence, but we can remember to come back to it, to honor the intelligence of our emotions, of our body, of our being as an integrated whole, rather than as something that we're trying to slice away parts of and ignore. So that's it for today. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. And I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to please like, follow, and share Enlightened World Network and me. The links are in the description. And as always, it's just a tremendous privilege to have the opportunity to have these morning musings together. And I'm so, so grateful. So until next time, so much love to you.